Good day, ladies and gentlemen. I am the Ephemeral One, and welcome back to something a little different. I know I spoke about this before and what I intend to do with the channel. Today is the beginning of one of the changes I intend to make. At least once a month, I plan to sit down and look over some of my writing that I want to forge into a a single book and possibly get things and try to get it published. I'll be sharing publicly some of the stories, not all of them, because I have to give you a reason to purchase the book. But some of the ones that are most integral and honestly ones I'll be actively writing sometimes in front of you at the time. So that's why this is more of a live writing sort of thing. So, I do already have a completed piece for today. So, like I said, I'll try to do it once a month, maybe sooner, maybe later. I do intend to still keep streaming video games and doing other things, but this was something that I felt like I couldn't do before that I feel I should start now. So, without further ado, I'll set some appropriate music, as you can see on the screen. This felt right. And just gonna lower it a bit so it's only background music. Thank you to Bardify, of course. And we'll go on to the beginning of The Winsome Plays, The Ones So Chosen. This is a story. This would be the first story chronologically of my works. So, it's always best to begin at the beginning. Appropriate if a bit bland. So, ladies and gentlemen, I will begin reading, and please sit back, enjoy. And I'll read to you. So, let's begin. Act 1. A child beloved of mountains and sky. Oh, mountain and sky. In a place very unlike the one we know, lived a people unlike us. They tread upon 4 legs, yet still have 2 arms. And unlike our home, their home was far more stony than Duncdom Water's depths. Mountains chained and stretched for endless miles, reaching towards the heavens. Tucked in plentiful valleys were the people so different to us. The creatures toiled in the dark, using claws, then tools, to scratch the mountains into dens. Towns grew as life took on a rhythm. Passages small and grand began to gnaw away at the rock. Life was discovered in hidden alcoves. Food became less scarce, and the people learned. In their learning, they began to give thanks. First, to the stone that provided both challenge and strength to their homes. Second, to the sky, which gave infrequent water, but also cold. As time passed and the people's wishes grew, a child was one day born. And so their fates were sealed, some fatalistic sorts would say. Yet the child was greeted with cheers, for on the day, whoops. This is why I'm doing this, folks. Sorry. Let's try again. Yet the child was greeted with cheers, for on the day of her birth it rained, and for 4 nights after the rain could be seen in the distance. This birthed something new in the neighboring valley, the first lake. Called the child beloved of the sky, the young ones sought to see the water once they could walk. In secret, taking stone chips from others, the child dug a secret tunnel to the lake. When discovered after a short time, again. and stone chips from others. Okay, I know what I meant. To make their own pick. The child dug a simple secret tunnel to the lake. When discovered, after being missing for a short time, he also discovered the child's tool could break other stones easily. Thus they became the child beloved of Mountain and Sky. Their family moved next to the lake. Thus those clear waters would watch over the child's younger years. Both parents were makers of tools, a position of honor in the sparse society. The beloved child showed crafting cunning in taking their lessons in peeks at the parents' work. Often stealing scraps and slag to practice with, the child would learn to make tools to dig, drive, and siphon. How different stones could be used, and how some would require the heat of flames to show their true worth. Though maturing, the child showed great talent. Their early tools able to pierce even harder stones than once thought impossible. Their siphons brought fresh air further into the mines than any others. Others, letting diggers work for longer in comfort. Braces made with the child's supports could hold better, letting them dig larger tunnels. So the town began to flourish, meeting other settlements. Seeing their wealth, others flocked to join the child beloved of Mountain and Sky. But what of the child themselves? There were pressures and expectations that unfolded and expanded beyond any single person could ever expect. Surely they were a detached genius, lonely and longing to be normal? Nay. Or perhaps a virtuous saint, taking on the troubles of others and viewing it as their purpose and duty to do so? Nay. An arrogant youth, viewing their immense talents as their birthright and crooning from dawn to dusk about their worship owed? Nay. The child was one surrounded by friends. Among them the child was scolded lovingly, applauded on their accomplishments, and he had given unconditional affection. What dismayed relations and onlookers was that the family that gave such things was unseen to their eyes. Just real quick, just to clean this up a little. Okay, and that's okay. There we go. Truly the girl was beloved. Windbursts swelled around her. Stone all but hopped into her furnace that burned hotter than any other. The lake rippled with every strike of her smithing hammer. The industrious youth sought ever finer results. Others sought to replicate her methods with varying results, but none could match her work, but many lessons were imparted. This is how the words began to be whispered behind her back, not out of jealousy, but of admiration and thankfulness. Her tools had brought many together and enabled harvesting of food so many could live in greater comfort. Despite this, the girl's connection to the unseen made them easy. So they called her goddess to distinguish her, to praise her, to keep her above them. Still, she considered them her friends and family. Still, her hammer thundered down, shaping stone into tools. Still, she Still, she kept the unseen ones with her. As you can see, it's far from perfect, but. And I'll do a reading at the end when I'm finished. It's one of those. This is one of those things that is extremely useful, I believe. Is having some. Reading your work out loud. It can be an extraordinarily useful thing to do so to catch all the little things you've done wrong. I'm also doing this writing so other writers can learn. Because at the end of the day, we learn from each other and we figure out what works for us and what works, what does and doesn't work for us. Oop, there we go. Sorry, I was just trying to line everything up. So, yeah, that was Act 1. I'll do like I said, I'll do a final reading after we're done with this, but I wanted to give an idea. Anyway, moving on, let's proceed. Act 2. A child beloved of rules and rulers. In a place very far from the tranquil lake of another was a city, likely the only one of its kind on that desolate world. Its vaunted towers covered in echelons meant to gather water and guide it to the tanks below. Each tank bore several guards that kept watch over those who would require it. It was on a rare day of rain that a great horn blared. First one, then more, their great bleating covering the valley for miles. At first, none knew its significance. Then runners screamed through once the horns were silent. It was a joyous day. The queen of the land had given birth. As with all things in this land, some cheered and others jeered. The king had an heir. That meant that naked grabs for power would be less effective, but also that, like any young one, the heir could be molded. Why did I... Yeah. Alright. Even the most ambitious would be humbled mere hours later. The queen declared she would give no more heirs. That her first child would be the only one. Her declarations set the tone for the new prince. Only the best were winnowed from the masses. The prince learned and learned and learned. Their youth spent on learning how to sprout, learning how, from sprout to crown, how an empire functioned, and despite the attempts to, the prince gained something beyond wisdom. The prince gained understanding. Showing kindness to the masses by sneaking them food and water, they would return their favor 100-fold. The prince understood how to sway others. Bending the decisions of the king, the prince earned adoration in the eyes of many. His position ensured the deference of the more powerful scavengers who sought greater power. Each time they thought they'd trap him, the prince refused to fall into their traps. He refused to share time with their children, did not dine with their families, and only spoke of common courtesies in their houses. The king was busy during the prince's youth. New tunnels brought new bodies to support and be sorted. Yet, that same growth meant greater freedom to tame the great mountains. One fateful day, the king and queen called their child. The youth even saw the assemblage of every important person in the audience chamber. Hiding their anxiety and discomfort behind a practiced mask of assurance, the prince stood before their parents. Mounted on the end of a long pole was a strange rock unlike any other. The king told of a time when their ancestor found the stone after it fell from the sky. It could pierce the hide of even the thickest warrior, and had felled many since its creation. So the king handed over the spear to the prince and gave him a quest. He would settle down the rebellion in another valley, and would not be able to return until it had been accomplished. So, with expectant escorts at his side, the prince traveled to the valley. If such a humble place could have been called that. Compared to the spiraling city that wound both skyward and deep into the world, the collection of hovels shocked the prince, almost as much as the haggard enemies who had been gathered in resentment. Trying to speak to the people, the prince was rebuffed. His words shouted down, and the voices grew only louder as they recognized the spear he held. Not once had the prince thought of why such a thing might be necessary. One who had lost a dear soul to that spear lunged after the prince. Without thought, the prince impaled his attacker, as the instructor had drilled in his body to. In horror, the prince watched the dying man reach for him, wanting revenge even as control of his limbs faded. The fight, more a slaughter, expounded outwards from that. When the rebels lay motionless, the prince looked out upon the field. None would console nor approach him. In the end, 5 more had fallen by the spear. The prince lamented and cursed his father for making this necessary. He spent the march home practicing the exact phrases he'd used to bring his father low. He'd throw the weapon at his father's feet and make his disgust known. Yet, what awaited them at the gate was a hero's welcome. Showers of accolades, praises, and tokens of thanks lined the road leading up to the spire of the king. The prince arrived before their parents, clutching their spear, some of the blood still clinging around the tip. The king stepped off his throne and withdrew a cloth. As the prince went to speak, the king wiped the blood off the spear. Words were whispered that sent chills down the prince's spine. Whatever transpired, the prince bowed his head and apologized for his negligence in cleaning the spear. Welcomed as a hero, the prince stood before their people, their legitimacy undeniable. And as some fatalistic sorts would say, their fates were sealed that day. Alright, that one went smoother, so hopefully that, if anyone notices any editing or has any questions, feel free. I'm sure I have no watchers at the moment, but I'm enjoying this, honestly. So let's continue. Act 3. A goddess protects, a king provides. Though distant, the valleys saw travelers regularly. Most followed the tunnels, charting obstructions, floods, or other problems. Boldest among these vagabonds would be those that climbed over the mountains. One such soul was the start to the problems. Exhausted from days at high altitudes, he found a strange valley filled with water. Thinking he'd gone mad, the hiker tried to climb down carefully. As one does when too tired, he overestimated the ease of getting down the slope. He tumbled down. His body was found by a lone woman. When he awoke, his injuries had been tended to, and some food had been left. Grateful for the kindness, the traveler spent his time recovering. He learned of the goddess who had found him and tended to his wounds before bringing him to his caretaker. Time had passed, and the naivete of youth had left the goddess. She continued to hone her craft and produce tools that were incomparable. However, she'd also taught others her art to shape stone to metal. Her tools were traded among the mountains as relics that granted great boons. The traveler saw the goddess only once and was smitten instantly. Her strength and capable mind were evident to all. Once healed and thankful, the traveler sought to return home. Facing the rough path over the mountains more carefully, the traveler returned home to his home in the kingdom with tales of what he'd seen. These stories would grow with each retelling till they reached the capital, where the recently crowned new king heard the story in passing. Thinking it was some wild story dreamed while too high up, he disregarded it. There were more pressing issues at hand. The tanks were unusually half full due to a drought, but a recently discovered underground lake had helped alleviate some of the pressure, though moving the water had been slow. It had not affected its food stores much yet. In addition, there was pressure from some of the major families to grant them ownership of valleys to ensure that they were run properly. Of course, they'd also require a dispensation of troops to keep order, or so they claimed. Days of deliberation had come to a standstill. Nobody made any progress. Then the story of far-flung merchants reached the holds of a goddess that made manifest, became a topic of idle chatter. Then the story from okay, that's what. Why am I caps lock on? From far-flung merchants reached the holds. Reach the castle, let's say. Tales of a goddess made manifest became Tales of a goddess made manifest became the topic of idle chatter. What began as speculation was silenced with a single comment. A foolish suggestion given weight by unspoken frustrations. The king should claim the goddess and make her his queen. A foolish suggestion. Okay, yeah. And it's a semicolon. Okay, better. The idea was silly, selfish, and arrogant, yet something about it spoke to a commonality they could support. To save their would-be queen from the savages from afar. Hearing this cry, the king dispatched scouts to begin the hunt. Soon the kingdom was united in the desire for a queen who had been known as a goddess. Yet none had told the goddess of their decision. Only a desperate, scared pilgrim crossed the mountains. Feeling he owed the goddess for saving his life, the traveler warned. Oh, I see. The traveler warned the goddess of the kingdom's intentions. Unafraid, the goddess brought the traveler before the others. The people pleaded for her to stop the attack, fearful of what others might do to them. Some wanted to offer her to them to avoid a fight. To prevent the attack. That sounds better. Fearful of what others might do to them, some wanted her to offer her in exchange. To offer her as sacrifice. That just sounds better. Okay, I think that works better. As a sacrifice, yeah, that works. Okay. Then the goddess spoke. She told them that she would not cower and would welcome them into their lands as she had done all the rest. That so long as they sought not to harm another soul, they would not be harmed in kind. With her declaration made, in hushed voices she whispered to the unseen, asking for their guidance, in something she had no idea how to do. Fight. A tunnel was dug with almost alarming speed. Time trickled by, and each strike of a pick measured out the moments to what would be considered inevitable. After a time, both sides began to dig towards the other, eager to know the truth. When they could hear the other side digging, both sent messages to their leader. Such as it was, the king and the goddess met as the diggers on both sides broke through. It took some time for them to clear a passage large enough for them to meet. Armed with only her hammer, The goddess asked their intentions. The king pointed his family spear and declared his claim on the goddess of their land, then promised the safety of all in their lands if she was brought forth. The goddess would be that the goddess would be his and help him unite the lands, and then he okay claim on the goddess of rumor. That sounds better. Then he promised safety of all in their lands if she was brought forth. He stated plainly that the goddess would be his and help him unite the lands, be his to help unite the lands and lead their people to greater glory. No, to glory. The goddess asked, what good would glory do? You couldn't eat it, use it to make something, or even keep you warm. Stunned at the declaration, the king stood in silence. I don't know why. Bad habit. Stood in silence. The goddess identified herself. And then did as the unseen friends bid her in the dark hours, where no one could hear. She reached out and asked for an ally to help, someone to do what she could not. Air swirled, sending all but the goddess fleeing backwards. Then, crouched low in the tunnel was the beast, a large monster with red eyes and a fanged maw. Its sudden arrival scared the king's soldiers. The workers behind the goddess shuddered and slowly sunk into the crevices of every rock. Determined not to show fear, the king thrust his familial weapon. With a snap of its maw, the summon monster crushed the head of the spear, then swallowed the remnants before hissing in fury that sent all fleeing. When they were alone, the monster lapped at the goddess's cheek affectionately. Shortly after that, the tunnel was collapsed by the kingdom. Unfortunately, their control of a neighboring valley was short-lived, since the summoned monster was able to easily clamber over the mountain. Thus began the war. A little rough there, but still overall pretty good. Alright. So we continue. Act 4. An absolute truth is that in war, for a long time, the world seemed split in two, with the great kingdom looming to the north and the southern people protected by the goddess and her monster. Even the goddess turned her attention away to crafting weapons, developing new ideas. She started to learn how to craft tools to kill. During the years she'd spent preparing, the monster had generated many spawns, lesser versions of itself that could fit where it could not. The goddess had several chances to test her weapons on those foolish enough to cross the mountains. These had given her an understanding of conflicts and the effectiveness of her creations. However, across the mountains the king sat upon his throne. Hushed whispers followed him. A failure who could not even capture a queen. A coward who lost his birthright to a monster. Every attempt to cross, be it under the mountains or above them, had been met with failure. Going around was slow, and his leaders began calling into question his abilities. When he'd solved the lack of food, they mocked him. When he added tanks and found new ways to melt water from the peaks to provide for his people's needs, they derided him. All because they had decided on their own that he was only fit for one queen. So long as that monster could cross the barriers, he had no recourse. That was when a soft voice entered his chamber. A soft-voiced person entered his chambers. I don't... Yeah. Soft... Words and promises were whispered. Promises of power, capable of weakening the monster, letting mortals slay it. Up to this point, its hide had resisted even the best crafted blades. Even in his dreams, the king heard the mocking words. He swore to he swore to the soft-spoken being that if it could end the voices, he would do anything. So they reached an agreement. If the monster was slain, the soft-spoken person would be made his official priest. The plan was set in motion, moving their forces into a valley. They could capture several of the valley. They could cap. They did. Their plan in motion. Moving into their forces into a valley, they captured several. Okay. This is why you read it aloud, folks. They captured several spawn of the monster, trapping them in cages. They left them in a particular pass. On both sides were steep cliffs. As expected, the monster came to find its crying children. Rain poured down that day. Then rocks poured down the cliff. The monster smashed the cages and shielded its children as best it could, only to slip, falling down the cliff. The children fled back home. After the last boulder was pushed down, the rain passed. The king hurried down the crevasse, finding the corpse of the monster. He ordered it butchered, and that the diggers return to their original cave and double its width. Messengers warning that the goddess Okay. Messengers were dispatched, warning that the goddess must surrender herself or every valley in her protection would be burned. Once more, in the same place, the two met. This time the goddess bore her own spear, and many others bore her weapons of war. The king's soldiers had fang-tipped spears and shields covered in familiar hide. The pair didn't discuss anything this time. There was nothing to talk over. One had been disgraced, the other pined for what was lost. And in the intervening days, pain had burrowed into their hearts. What now smoldered. What now smoldered as faded agony, now blossomed as fury. In the goddess's hands, the spear sent shockwaves through all it pierced. Some fell blind, others deafened, and even more crippled in countless ways that did not kill. Not a single soul in that first battle was ended by her hand, nor for those who followed her, and thus her vindictive victory was secured. As the stars rose, a great fire was held, dispersing the stolen parts of the monster. And for the first time, the goddess left her domains. Taking the boldest with her, she marched towards the enemy. Welcomed as liberators with open arms, the goddess marched through uninhibited. They passed through valleys, adding to their numbers. The people adored the goddess, and she frequently halted to assist more neglected places the king hadn't. Perched in his tower, scouts reported frequently to the king. As he listened, the newly appointed priest stood at his side. They both smiled at some shared joke that none in the great chamber could know. Others seemed nervous of her army and the tunnels lost to her. Yet the king was perfectly assured. With her armor within striking range of the tower, the goddess rested, letting everyone gather to avenge their fallen friend. The night was long and dark. Clouds gathered, yet no rain fell. It was in those deep shadows that the flames found the goddess. Untamable blazes roared through her camp. Jagged arrows tore through the flesh and snapped bones. Screams echoed all around. Amidst the chaos came the king, descending down from the mountains after the last shaft was sped. The rest of his army erupted from secret tunnels. Traitors amidst the goddess's army made themselves known, slaying their once allies. Exhausted and weakened, the goddess could barely lift her spear when the king found her. Knocking her weapon away, he whispered the words that chilled his soul as a youth. An absolute truth is that in war, there is no justice, just a means to an end. Now, how's everyone doing? This is... Oh, I don't know why. Oh, give me a break. Go, close. There we go. Sorry, hit the wrong button. Yeah, no. This is one of those reasons. I'm glad I'm doing this because it really does help to read things out loud. So, we move on to Act 5, Glory's Flavor. Jules caught the early morning light as it slowly lowered into the valley. Despite the early hour, the murmur of quiet conversations was almost deafening. Some had left their homes in the middle of the night. All had heard the army returned a few days prior, but no word had come of the results. Every soldier who lined the square hadn't taken part in the fighting, so could only answer honestly that they knew nothing. More light descended, and the glittering gems flashed above the square. Then the gems shifted, and their almost blinding glare silenced all. A headdress adorned in bright metals and gems shone from above. Approaching the dais overlooking the square, the king raised his arms. Explaining his victory over the goddess, the king was soaked in adulation. Then he stepped to the side to reveal the new queen. Decorated in brilliant cuffs and a similar headdress, the goddess saw countless beings cheering her captivity. Though only a few days had passed since her capture, she knew it was pointless to do anything here. Her people were under watchful eyes and bows. So the queen waved and greeted her new servants. The king was not seen for the rest of that day. Many hushed whispers came about him, furthering the bloodline. Thus began the king's joy. 'Twas not long till a child was confirmed. Not wanting to be far from the queen, the king named several servants to take care of the outer regions, including the home of the queen. Many of the conflicts in his audience chamber became easier to handle, and he focused on preparing what would be needed for his own child, as his parents had done for him. Unsurprisingly, there came a request for assistance with the queen's homeland. Many refused to believe or follow their new ruler's orders, even at the threat of bow point. So the king and queen made their way there. Seeing the queen left all awestruck, not only because of the number of soldiers in her escort, but the fact that she was obviously pregnant. Meeting her family, the queen was given her old smithing tools, the pretense for her visit. Upon their return to the tower, the queen was sequestered. Her private chambers would act as a prison and fortress against any potential machinations against the king's child. and before long, a daughter was born. Despite giving birth, the queen was not permitted out of her chambers. Her incarceration began due to the king's absence. His orders left her in the tower as he went on his expeditions. The reason for his departure were the trusted allies he'd sent to watch over the land had raised forces in rebellion. Claiming their own divine rights, each sought to bring others into their lands. So the king began new wars, going far afield to retain what his ancestors had built. When one was cowed by might or cunning, another would resist. Months stretched into years, and though the emotional daggers became a multitude in the king's back, he did not complain. Instead, he would visit his priests and offer ablutions to the needs of his people. In her long captivity, the queen's jailers became complacent, allowing her to roam, and eventually she managed to gather enough to create a forge. Like her own childhood, due to the king's absence and lack of influence on their child, the queen's daughter spent it watching the creation of tools. Days in and out, the queen made only tools that had no malicious intent. Dining ware, vents for air, replacement limbs, and other mundanities. A simple life that greatly resembled her old one. The only difference was the occasional intrusion of the king. Emotionally exhausted, he'd stumble in, too tired despite his intentions to sire another heir. Instead, the queen would watch over him as he slept, feeding him when he stayed long enough to try, and impart some lessons on their daughter. Eventually, she was gathered up by his assembled tutors to rule one day. It was during that time that a great battle took place. In the valley adjacent to the towers, united forces of the outlying regions managed to push so far into the heart of the king's domain. Days of fighting came and went. Trenches and walls rose and were torn down. Stones rained in some places, and soft earth gave way to angry pits of jagged spikes in others. Yet none could strike a decisive blow. Though along, the king's fervor drove his onward until they couldn't move. So came the worst affront to the king's life. He was forced to declare a truce with his enemies. Act 6. The one who chooses hatred. Shocked but unbowed, the king offered nothing but praise for his army, commending their bravery and diligence that kept the tower safe. After that day, the king did not visit the queen nor checked on his daughter's progress, which had actually been inspiring to the queen. Her daughter had shown no sense for the unseen, nor did her creations beam with the same powers the queen's did. Instead, the daughter had a gift of foresight, often forestalling problems long before they became an issue. Her sharp mind could also bend like the most gnarled root, often making those with petty or selfish intentions learn the futility of such an action. Despite her maturity, the princess still retained a playful side, making games that she could play with her captive parent. It was during one such bout between parent and child that news arrived. The queen and daughter would be required for a meeting. The king would be inviting his former servants into the tower to discuss making a treaty that would last years. Exhilarated by the prospect of being involved in a political event, the daughter spent much of the following night charting potential courses for her land, cutting deals and shaping the land in her mind into a thriving land beyond the king's designs. That night, the ringing from the queen's forge was ceaseless. Days piled up, eclipsed only by the anxiety of the tower's residents. Details were attended to in quintuplet. Any faults found could reflect poorly on the king, for whom his pride had become everything. Punishments were readily handed out in the days leading up to the meeting. Guarded and guided down into the meeting hall, the queen dressed in the same items that she'd worn on the day she was given the title. Adjustments and new jewels glittered on the headdress. A smaller one decorated the head of the daughter. Their entrance made the king stand up and made a show of complimenting them, both of them, enough to make him seem cordial. The guards guided the pair to their position, flanking the king on one side, and on the other was the priest, several followers all adorned in shadows. The daylight filled the chamber as the guests arrived one by one, each flanked by their own most trusted guards. The king had even permitted a limited force of their private armies into the tower. The first day was spent on introductions, titles, and making positions clear. On the second day, brisk deliberations began with veiled threats of might behind them. Third and fourth days were bogged down by minutiae and absentees. During days 5 through 10, heated arguments over boundary lines raged. It was on the 14th day of deliberations that the king entered the chamber, flanked by the queen and their daughter, but more so by the priest and their numerous servants, all cloaked in black. They dominated the back part of the audience chamber. Determined not to be cowed by the display, the former servants of the would-be king and would-be kings tried to begin deliberations. The king silenced them with a wave of his hand and made an announcement. He would be retaking all his rightful lands. He would be retaking all his rightful lands, explaining that none of the traitors to the king would be leaving the chamber, and thanked them for their sacrifice. Immediately, weapons were drawn, but even the mightiest warrior was overwhelmed by the priest's followers. The queen demanded an explanation. Eager to boast, the king told her that he'd poisoned all of them and would sacrifice them in a rite to bestow him with their power. Their daughter recoiled in horror as the king admitted that the only way to be sure they were poisoned was to poison the tanks that all drank from. Outside, the screams of slaughter and violence raged. The king giggled and laughed as he hurried out to the square. Below, soldiers and civilians slaughtered each other. Passing through the violence untouched were the priest's followers, placing symbols on every corpse they passed. The king began to emit an aura of hatred. The queen and daughter found themselves hating him. The king smiled and the queen's eyes widened. The unseen ones whispered in her ear that what had begun. He'd given up his personhood, morality, and individuality for the power to rule. He was a monster that grew off hatred. Hatred of him, his hatred of others, hatred of their sparse world. Hate, 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 hate. The aura of anger grew, becoming more tangible so none could approach the king. Worse still, his orders were still followed by those who weren't weakened by the poison, and the tower was consumed in hatred and chaos. Blood followed. Act 7. The Road Chosen. Two figures kept to the side of the road, cloaked in black robes, and both carried spears. In the faint light of the torches, you could make out the faded bloodstains around the spear points. Time was measured in breaths as the pair fended off the followers of hate in their own exhaustion in equal measure. The queen tried to reassure her daughter that it wasn't far now, and it was true. It wouldn't be far till they reached her homeland, to her hut by the lake she'd left so long ago. The unseen urged her on, their promises of sanctuary growing more fervent the closer they drew, though, as if to spite the desperate parent and child, the wind swirled even in the tunnels. Black cloaks, harbingers of the king's hatred, had spread out in all directions. In a matter of days, every valley had a group of darkly clad soldiers. Sometimes they'd torture a group, lavish another with gifts, and others they'd kill outright, always seemingly arbitrary. Only the queen understood. Of those who had been in the chamber at his ascension, only she had come through unharmed. Her chamber had a private water source, a meager luxury she was thankful for now. Her daughter had not come away unscathed. Some of the poison had sent her into coughing fits periodically. She knew that the king's goal was to be hated, because by doing so, he could pull on all the souls that he had injured. The unseen hissed loudly when several cloaks approached. The queen readied her spear and waited. In the tunnel, there weren't places to hide, but traps could be present all the same. Errant arrow shots showered the tunnel in spikes. The queen bit her lips. The barbed heads were had likely been from her own forge, now turned against her. Lasara could only seek the fire, the meager cover. The queen. Queen could only seek meager cover of a nearby rock. A hand drew her back, and the queen stumbled. Hand drew her back, and the queen stumbled backwards. Oh. A hand clutched her cloak. Clutched her cloak, and the queen stumbled backwards, her eyes wide in horror, seeing her daughter had been the one to push her away. Then she saw why. The archers had never intended to strike them. Instead, a powder barrel was hidden behind her chosen hiding spot. The final shot struck the ceiling, and enough sparks finally reached the powder. All at once the world was consumed in a violent roar that was followed by a pained silence. Stillness ruled the world around the queen. Most agonizing was the single limb protruding from the rubble. Sobs broke the silence for a long time. Even as the unseen pulled and attempted to drag away the grieving parent, the queen ignored them. She uttered a single lie. You would have hated being the ruler. It was then that the daughter joined the unseen and whispered a truth to the queen. Father and his black cloaks are devouring souls. As the daughter faded, the goddess rose to stand. With a wipe of her hands, the rocks melted and shifted, reshaping them into a tomb for the daughter. The rest of the stone parted enough to reveal several shocked black cloaks. In a flash of fury, the goddess's spear tore through their cloaks. Gaping holes from their impalements left them desperately grasping at their wounds. The unseen quaked and pleaded for her to continue, sparing only a glance to the elegant stonework that would enshrine the pain of the loss of a child. The goddess continued on. Reaching the other end of the tunnel, the goddess's shoulders lowered. Another truth revealed in the bare buildings, all bearing scorch marks. It had been long enough that only some scattered bones remained of the vibrant people who had lived with her long ago. Passing through the ruins, the goddess was surprised at the numbness and pain that had melted together. A new agony pierced the goddess. A ragged, gaunt figure scrambled out from one of the ruins, discarding their bow for a short, crippled, chipped blade stained with rust. The point trembled in quaking hands. Desperately, the attacker thrust forward, but the goddess was faster and had greater reach. Her spear tore open a gaping orifice in the man. Collapsing to the side, the man clutched at his missing side. He hissed, I believed in you, whore goddess. It wasn't until the light faded from his eyes. The light faded and his eyes rolled back that the goddess recognized him. The traveler that had stumbled into her home so long ago. Now his story has ended. The goddess proceeded to her old home. The humble forge by the water had no sign of damage. Even new tools had been made to replace the old ones she'd taken with her to the tower. Taking a fresh bit of metal, the goddess began to shape it. Alone, the ringing of her hammer was her only companion. From the water rose a head, narrow with a wide jaw. As the creature opened its mouth, it explained, "We of the world love you. We would offer you the tools to create a happier future." Joined by another being of great wings, it whispered, "For as things stand right now, the king of hatred shall consume every soul and spread like a plague." "Why?" the goddess mumbled. "Because we love—" "No! Why now? Where were you when my army was routed? Each day I spent alone, shaping tools and weapons for the bastard who—" The goddess sobbed. Both spirits spoke in unison. "We were always there." The monster who had guarded these lands looked over from further down the lakeside. "We all were. You no longer called out to us. Hatred of that man stole your joy and awareness of that around you. But we loved you, so we stayed and watched you. But even in your shared hatred, you found something to be happy about." "So what now?" the wings whispered. "We give ourselves, granting you ascension naturally that the king would take by force." The wide-mouthed creature rose further from the water, revealing a cylindrical body. The sky grew cloudy as it added, "From there, it is up to you how to use our power. Just know, if you do nothing, this world shall be dead. There is not enough life left in the living to revive it. Do it." The goddess accepted. Act 8, wherein our story begins. A storm raged and battered the battlements of the tower. Every tank of water had overflowed days ago. The chaos and fury had spilled out hours before. Now only the meager survivors pursued the few dry locations remaining. Then, as quickly as the storm descended, it ended. Eyes gathered to marvel at the open skies above. Their gaze beheld twin silvery wings. A long, cylindrical body, attached to the wings, ended in a narrow head. The great monster they beheld boomed, "King of hatred, I hereby banish you from this world." Descending, the great beast coiled around the tower. The tower was quickly turned into blood and rubble. Erupting from the stone were long, flexible limbs. Dozens of them erupted from the rock. The goddess's new wings beat the air. Despite the clinging arms, she rose above the mountains, dragging a bulbous main body airborne. The creature hissed, "You fool! In destroying my form, you only freed me! I am the master of this world!" "No," the goddess responded, spinning her body. The goddess sent the newly released god of hate skyward. Winds spun the god violently as javelins of stone and steel rose from the mountains, sticking into its orb-like main body. The god body. Oops. Screwed that up. The goddess called down bolts of lightning from the open sky. Leaping upon the charred and beaten god of hate, her mouth opened wide. Bite after bite tore at its flesh apart. all while the god of hate laughed. He mocked. Don't you understand? So long as you hate me, you'll never be rid of me. Blobs of the god fled into holes torn in the open sky. Only his laughter remained. The goddess rose above the sky into the infinite black. During her ascension, all of creation seemed immensely vast, but also incredibly small at the same time. Then her eyes returned to the stony gray rock that had been her home. She could sense no life left in that world. The god of hate had driven many to sacrifice themselves, and those that had survived were crushed beneath the fight. Using her newfound power, the goddess restored everything to as it was in her memories. Then the world was sealed away from all, hidden away. The goddess swore, I shall find or make a weapon to kill you, god of hate, my bitter husband, for your own sake as much as our daughter's. She then vanished among the stars to make good on her vow. So there we go. I'm very much approve of this. I like this a lot. And now that I've read it aloud, it does seem to flow a bit better. So, anyway, like I said, this isn't going to be a constant thing, but just something I want to do and I want to get myself back into. So, anyway, thank you all for joining me. No. Yeah, no. So what I may do is I may cut... I'm not sure how I want to handle this. Well, either way, I'll figure it out because I probably want to do a final reading, but I want to save it for when I'm done. And this is pretty good, but this is the first of 2 parts. We'll look at the other part next time. So anyway, thank you all for joining me. I have been the Ephemeral One, and this was the beginning of my work on writing. Thank you all for joining me, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now, folks. Bye for now.